It's important to remember that in the semiconductor industry, the government has long played an important role, but it's not the decisive role. The decisive role is still going to be played by the market, technology, good management products that are going to help companies be successful or maybe even fail in the market. But what governments can do is provide an environment that promotes innovation. And there's a lot of different factors. It's not just about providing incentives for manufacturing, but it's also having a more holistic strategic approach that includes creating a fair marketplace, enforcing competition laws, protecting intellectual property, investing in universities and the workforce so that there's smart people that can go work for semiconductor companies worldwide. It's also promoting trade and strengthening the global semiconductor value chain because these products are made across dozens of countries and it requires collaboration and cooperation between a lot of different partners. But in addition, we think a proper role of government is also to help promote growth in the industry. And that has to be done in a careful and balanced way because on the one hand, while it's important to promote that growth through things like limited grants or tax incentives to help promote the growth of domestic firms, we also don't want too heavy a hand of the government that might lead to things like overcapacity or intervention in the market in a way that might alter the competitive outcomes. Again, it's really about how does a government create that environment where it can foster organic growth within its borders. And one really important thing as we see, for example, the European Union you mentioned is looking at investing in the microelectronics industry with a small group of countries. South Korea recently has prioritized, for example, AI semiconductors and advanced semiconductor materials. Even Japan is looking at, for example, investing in semiconductor advanced packaging. One really important factor is that we have to realize that no one company and no one government can have an entirely self-sufficient semiconductor supply chain within its own borders. This industry is just too complex, too globally distributed, and built upon these amazing global value chains that the cost and the inefficiency that it would create and trying to build all of that inside your borders is just impractical. And the US semiconductor industry does not support, reshoring of entire semiconductor supply chains, nor do we support decoupling from the global value chain or the Chinese semiconductor value chain, because we all need to be integrated, work together to have efficiency so that we can build better, smaller, faster chips for our consumers and customers. I think after COVID-19, in fact, it's the opposite. More governments realize the strategic importance of having resilient supply chains. Last year when multiple governments were going into lockdown to try and contain the pandemic, there was a shortage of supplies across the world from, personal protective equipment to ventilators to help people battle COVID inside the hospitals to, critical medical equipment like masks and protective face shields so that, hospital personnel would be able to protect themselves from the pandemic as well. And so that really, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of governments that for some, very strategic supplies, if they're overly concentrated, perhaps in one region, there needs to be perhaps some smart investments to help sort of redistribute where maybe some of that activity happens. Again, that doesn't mean that government should decouple from the global supply chain, that they should onshore everything. That's impossible. As I mentioned, no one company or country is able to do the entirety of the semiconductor supply chain on its own. But again, I think what the pandemic has reinforced for policymakers and capitals from Beijing to Brussels to Washington is that they need to have some smarter policies to help manage the risks. And in fact, the European Union has prioritized no less than 20% of their COVID recovery funding for the digital economy, and that includes semiconductors as well. In the United States, you're seeing Just this week, President Biden hold a microchip in his hands and talk about how important it is to have a resilient domestic semiconductor supply chain here in the United States as well. Not yet. As we understand it, and what I've read from the public media, is that the initial 1.9 trillion COVID recovery package, which again, that's still under negotiation between the White House, the House, and the Senate here in Washington, D.C. So a lot of the details are not yet final, and they're still being negotiated amongst the political parties. But our understanding is that that investment will be focused primarily on the more immediate and urgent priorities of containing the pandemic, increasing testing for COVID-19, expanding the number of vaccinations that U.S. citizens are able to access, and also providing more economic aid to small businesses, to workers who may have lost their job during the pandemic. So right now, the focus of that $1.9 trillion stimulus package is really on the short-term issues related to the pandemic, and it's probably not likely to include issues such as supply chains and domestic infrastructure. But there are other opportunities for semiconductor-related funding. As I mentioned, President Biden has been talking about a Build Back Better agenda, where he wants to use investment from the U.S. government to spur new things like smart infrastructure, new roads, bridges, and maybe even digital infrastructure to help find new sources of economic growth for the United States. And it seems like there's a lot of support actually in the U.S. Congress for those kind of investments.